out from the coronavirus pandemic. The question is now, what role can debt and debt forgiveness play in negotiating the new partnership between Europe and Africa? Jean, you're in Brussels. Tell us what role the debt and debt forgiveness can play in negotiating the new partnership.
Thank you very much, Shiponda. And again, it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation this afternoon. First of all, let me say that while it is important that debt has come to the forefront of the discussion, given the current crisis, it's by no means a new issue on the table. Actually, we in Eurodad, as a network on debt and development, have been monitoring the situation for a number of years. And in fact, just before the crisis erupted and the pandemic broke loose, we had come out with a report which pointed out that already between 2010 and 2018, essentially governments, developing country governments, have been paying out in debt a service more than 83, the amount that they have been paying out in debt servicing has grown by more than 83% in the last 8 to 10 years. And in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, government revenue destined for external debt service has more than doubled in the time, from around 4%, 4.5% in 2010 to around 10% or even more than 10% in 2018. Now, going to the question of partnership, this is an interesting question. I remember in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, debating with the EU, with the European Commission, about the future of the EU's development cooperation policy. At that time, understandably, there was a lot of fiscal consolidation, and essentially ODA budgets were one of the casualties. And this was a trend across the world. So noticeably, what we have seen in the last 10 years since the financial crisis has been a deterioration of concessional finance, and basically governments having to resort to issue government bonds to also borrow on the commercial markets, but also turn to non-traditional bilateral lenders. And that has brought us to the current situation where we are in right now with regard to the debt crisis in the context of COVID, in particular, where countries' economies have shrunk, as we see trade flows have reduced, obviously tourism and all the other revenue flows that countries in the global south, and particularly in Africa, have depended on, have basically closed down. And essentially what we are seeing right now is a very complex debt situation, and the response being almost a band-aid response. What we have right now on the table is essentially one initiative, which is the debt suspension initiative, the debt servicing suspension initiative of the G20, the G20 DSSI initiative. Now, what that essentially does is it kicks the ball down the road in that it is basically suspending debt servicing, and not just not all debt servicing, but only debt servicing of what we would call official creditors, and not all official creditors, but obviously official bilateral creditors. So essentially G20 countries, Paris Club countries are part of that deal. So that is not very much. If you look at it in debt terms, it's just about 22.5% of the total debt overhang that we are, debt servicing that we are seeing at the moment from Paris Club creditors that have been suspended, and non-Paris Club creditors about, they, 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 they are, of course, a much larger amount, but again, it's still just, I'd say, a drop in the ocean of the current debt situation that African countries are facing.
Just to sort of piggyback on that, on what you just mentioned. So is there, given the major role that EU countries play then in the IMF and the World Bank, so is there an argument for them to play a bigger role on debt forgiveness, you know, right now? Should they be playing a bigger role as a result of this? You just mentioned the 22, it's just 22%. So what should the EU countries be doing?
I think the EU as a union, as well as countries specifically, can play certainly a much larger role in terms of providing concessional emergency finance. That is the immediate need on the table, humanitarian finance, which is additional to ODA, certainly something that the EU can do upfront. That should be something immediately demanded as in the context of the partnership we are discussing at the summit. But beyond that, also, as you rightly mentioned, the EU is part of multilateral development banks, is part of the IMF. Now, the IMF has put forward an initiative as part of its catastrophe containment trust. Now, obviously, that is also about suspending debt servicing, but only for a little while. A lot more can be done. There is talk about a new issuance of special drawing rights. I think the EU can play an important role, even though it is not the most important instrumental actor in making a decision. It is the US, but the EU has quite a determining role to play in the executive board of the IMF, can make its voice very, very clearly heard, can support the African Union's calls in this regard, for sure. Also in the multilateral development banks. Multilateral development banks have not yet put forward any credible response so far, kind of hiding behind their fears of credit rating. I know that this is a point for discussion today, but over there too, I think a lot can be done to push multilateral development banks to go towards at least credit debt suspension, debt service suspension, if not debt cancellation outright.
Thank you, Jean. And you Jean just mentioned there the credit rating. So that kind of could maybe lead us into the next question. Maybe Abdelmalek can answer that. What role could a debt write-off or moratorium play on the reputation of African countries in the international financial markets? So Abdelmalek, what do you think what would happen if there's a debt write-off or a moratorium?
Well, I believe in terms of optics and communication, it wouldn't look that good, but we've already had an experience with the Bono initiative in 2002, and he is actually right now one of the main players leading the conversation between the EU and Africa with the high-level group that is at the level of the Commission, and they have maybe the smartest people in the room to answer this question and to steer this discussion. But the way I look at it, I understand, of course, the macroeconomics, the microeconomics, the dynamics, the COVID. But remember when the Titanic was sinking and the band was still playing? Well, we Africans are the band. Because when you look at it in terms of strategy, we are facing a trilemma. We have a dilemma with no way out on the three dimensions of the problem. Dimension number one is that in 2015, the two curves of who holds African debt crossed for the first time since the independence. It means that the majority of debt of African countries right now is held by private investors. So if you want to rip off people that put private money and took your debt, that's going to be very difficult to do because you're going to face huge legal actions. It happened to Argentina. We know how it ended. The second thing is value and reality of balance sheet of a lot of African countries, and especially countries that are dependent on extractive industries and oil. Their balance sheets are just full of lies. And recent history has just shown us that countries that were projecting a ratio on debt of 80% were really at 125% or 130% because they found new ways to finance, I would say, the way of life of their government and social peace by taking credits from big actors from the oil industry or extractive industries. And the third thing is, how are we going to restart African economies when we have in front of us Europe that is talking about repatriating most of its industry? Those guys are ready to give billions and billions of dollars to car makers, to shoemakers, to textile workers to come back to their countries. And in the same time, they don't want us to increase migration. I don't see how this is possible. So the three parts of this trilemma are just absolutely crazy. So if we focus on relieving the debt and the public debt, I mean, that's just a small part of the problem, because even if we are able to raise more money, and I understand that the objective when you relieve the debt is to raise more money, where are you going to put this money? Are you going to pay civil servants with them? If you cannot put the money in productive economy, if you don't create jobs for tomorrow, and you have a partner in front of you who is giving you no choice, it's very difficult to answer this trilemma. And of course, I believe most of the people here were in Abidjan in 2017 during the EU and AU summit. It was very romantic. I heard about the Marshall Plan of $50 billion of Commissioner Juncker. Where is the money? We don't see the money. 20% of this money is going to consultants that are 20 kilometers away from Brussels. This is the case in Morocco. I can give you very precise numbers that were calculated by the Moroccan government. They appoint people that come here. They're inside the ministries. They're paid $10,000 a month. And at the end of the day, the money doesn't go to project. It goes to the continent of thinking and PowerPoint. So now we need pragmatic solutions to real and instant and clear problems, which is to reset the economies, to find a way to distribute wealth between North and South that will calm the North with their fear about migrations, and that will allow Africa also to retain some of its talents. I can give you some statistics. 50% of Moroccan engineers, they emigrate to France before even graduating. Mm-hmm. Those guys get a visa in 15 days. So these are the hard, tough conversations that today as Africans we need to have with Europe. And we need to tell them something very simple. Listen, 3 years ago when there was the migrant crisis and the peak of the Syrian crisis, there was 500 million rich people screaming and shouting about 1 million migrants. In Africa, we're 1 billion, we're poor, and we have 18 million migrants every year. So these are the kind of trade-offs that we need to do with ourselves. And of course, we need to go to really shift the paradigm, trade, not aid, but we need as well to do our homework as Africans to present projects that are viable, to have projects that are good in decarbonation of the economy, in the digital world, and not just white elephants and infrastructure projects that are not giving us enough return on employment and on jobs. We really need to speed up the quality of our projects in Africa. This is the three main branches of the trilemma that we are facing when it comes to debt relief in Africa.
Right. And Jean, perhaps maybe you could pick that up on in terms of balancing the need for foreign direct investment and debt distress. in your discussions in Brussels, what kind of, solutions, ideas have come up, as ways of, finding the right balance between debt and FDI? Is there anything on the table or anything that you've come across that clearly shows that people are thinking about that and making it work?
Well, I think Abdul Malik had a lot of very important points over here. I do agree Africa needs investment. It's the kind of investment and the kind of foreign investment or national investment that is important. It is the investment, the quality of the investment that is important. And that's the question we've also been asking the EU. If you're pushing an investment policy, what kind of investment policy? Is it about basically promoting EU economic interests, or is it about genuinely promoting local economies? That's the kind of investment that we would see, which actually is promoting small, medium-sized, particularly women-led companies, of course, ensuring that the economic kind of the overall economy is supported, the kind of investment, and also the institutions that provide investment are the right ones. But I would also emphasize the need to address debt. And why do we emphasize this and why do we work on this is because we've seen, and the pandemic is an ultimate witness of the many years of underinvestment in the public sector, particularly in the health sector. And the fact that many countries, I mean, of course, across the world, this pandemic is a huge challenge and a huge burden on the health system. And particularly for countries who, because of austerity policies, who because of a consistent underinvestment in the public sector and particularly the health sector, is finding it incredibly difficult to deal with the current health crisis. I think we've done research, and what we found is that there is a close correlation between debt distress or high levels of debt burden and debt overhang, and the quality of investment, particularly in public services and the healthcare. And that's why, in the context of this crisis, in the context of a discussion of how do we respond to the crisis, what lessons do we learn from the crisis, one important point that we have been putting forward is the need to really rethink the whole architecture, the whole governance of sovereign debt. I think one of the issues that has gone under the table for too long is the fact that the current public debt governance system is dominated by the North. It is basically the Paris Club for public creditors, the London Club for private creditors, that essentially have been dominating the discourse on sovereign debt. And what we are asking for is to move this discussion, move the question of who arbitrates on sovereign debt to more democratic spaces in the UN.
Okay, so you would want it to move to the UN, for instance?
Yeah, indeed. We do believe that the current circumstances, the current discussions, the current process that has been started by the UN, led by Jamaica and led by Canada, provide important opportunities. I think the EU should be playing a very important role. I think Africa is already investing in this, and we do hope that this will be a way to push this discussion forward.
Abdel Malek, would you agree with Jean that the discussions and the negotiations on debt and African debt should be taking place somewhere else, and not with where they've traditionally taken place, you know, with the Paris Club, for instance. What do you think? What do you make of this? What would your, you know, opinion be on that?
I think that the quality of the conversation about debt in Africa will improve tremendously when most finance ministers of African countries would stop starting their speech by saying according to the World Bank or according to the IMF. The problem is the quality of the economics knowledge we produce as Africans. It is very small. And as you know, when you are a poor country or an emerging country, it's very difficult to fund academics and intellectuals. So in the discussion, you are in an asymmetric fight because you are discussing with people that have more tools, that have the ideology, have the power, have the academics, the Nobel Prizes, and you have very few African economics that are thinking about the way we can finance our development that could be specific to this huge continent with huge geographical challenges, with a lot of small countries that don't have access to the sea, that don't have access to the ports, that are very fragmented, that don't have regional unions. So I believe that the center of gravity of the conversation has to go out from the Bretton Woods institutions and from the institutions coming from the Washington Consensus. And this happens at a very specific moment. It happens at a moment where a lot of economists that used to work for the World Bank or the IMF are doing their mea culpa about structural adjustment and the programs they did in the 80s where they cut the social subsidies and they have created huge poverty and they have increased disparities. And it also happens very ironically at a moment where the World Bank is putting under review the Doing Business report, which is the alpha and omega of foreign direct investment, which is something that has been criticized for years. But at the end of the day, the 25-year-old junior analyst at Morgan Stanley, when he wants to give you credit or not give you credit, he's going to the World Bank because he needs to back up his research. So I would say that the key, and I was advocating this at the Commission, I was saying, listen, when you want to discuss with us about trade, you lend us consultants that are coming from the north, and then you tell us in which way you're going to eat us, basically. Our problem is intellectual independence in the field of economics and development. And you have very few economists that are really at the forefront on how you can refinance Africa. You have Ricardo Hausmann from the Center of Economic Complexity in Harvard. He's Venezuelan, so I guess he understands Africans better, and we have a community of faith in the trajectories. And I believe this whole conversation needs an honest broker. The problem is that Africa is at the center of all geopolitical fights. You cannot have the East as an honest broker. You cannot have the West as an honest broker. You cannot have the North as an honest broker. So the only choice in front of us is to empower a new generation of African thinking, a new generation of people who are thinking about ways to finance our economies, because obviously, if we were in the position to do quantitative easing and to use our signature right now to do a money helicopter in Africa, we would do it. The problem is that we cannot do it. It's impossible. So as I told you at the beginning, I see it as a trilemma. We have a dead end in front of us. And I think that what you said, Jean, is very important, because I would really appreciate it and love it if the EU was promoting its economic interests in Africa. Because
I don't know if we've lost Abdel Malek there. He seems so frozen. Can everyone hear me? All right. Maybe, Jean, you want to pick up on his point, because I think we may have lost him. I can't hear him anymore. But maybe I was also wondering. Oh, Abdel Malek, we lost you there. If you could just maybe rewind a minute ago.
At the end of the day, it's economic. I think. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can. Yeah.
I'll just finish my last sentence. I said, I hope that Europe will promote its economic interest in Africa, because at the end of the day, its economic interest is to have a bigger market. So, this is the kind of strategic analysis and vision we need. We need to be richer if you want us to buy European products and to buy Audis and to buy big fancy German cars. But we need to have a good production in Africa, and you have to let us our fair share of industry in order to be able to export products that don't have this kind of technology, but to retain our talents, to retain people who can help us think. I hate to quote Chairman Mao, but he once said, we need the head and the legs. And that's we have very good legs in Morocco and in Africa, and this is why we always win at the Olympics in long distance, but we need to put more head in it, and we need to empower ourselves intellectually, especially in the field of economics and trade.
Yeah, maybe Jean, you could also mention something about what Abdelmalek just spoke about. He mentioned, of course, this asymmetry as well, and between, of course, the knowledge and, you know, economists and people, consultants from the West being, you know, hired to work, of course, in the global South, in Africa, obviously, and coming up with solutions. And is that part of the problem? And is this something that you see changing with perhaps with the current negotiations? Can that change? Is it even realistic to expect to change? Maybe you could just pick up on that. And while you're doing that, I would like to call on everyone to submit questions, because we know we do want to answer your questions as well. So Jean, just take that one.
Yeah, no, a number of interesting points over there, Abdelmalek. I mean, I think I'd love it if the EU would define its economic interests as really ensuring that economic prosperity in Africa is a common economic interest. Absolutely. I mean, that's how we would like to see it. Unfortunately, it tends to be basically round-trip investment. It is basically seeing what is the most lucrative returns that you can get out of kind of dipping into Africa and dipping out. And that's what we want to change. That's the narrative on investment that we want to change. And hopefully common interest is economic interest, same. Absolutely, on intellectual hegemony, that's something that we have been pushing back on. I mean, the Washington consensus is alive and kicking, and now it is being replaced by the Wall Street consensus, where basically it is large, tends to be northern institutional investors that are calling the shots on what we call SDG investment. So that's something, that's another conversation I'd be happy to have, but it's a conversation in itself. And I do think that we need to break open this conversation. We as civil society do believe that platforms, processes, that are hosted by the UN offer more opportunities for pluralistic intellectual debate. I think what we have seen, I already mentioned this in the last couple of months, the whole discussion and the process that has been started, led by Jamaica and Canada, bringing in the likes of Ricardo Hausmann, but a whole host of academics from across the world, really indicates this. And so I fully agree with that. I mean, obviously, we have doublespeak at the moment. I mean, we've seen trillions being pumped into the global north. And that is thanks to the global financial safety net that there is kind of central bank swaps, there is IMF lending, and only a fraction of countries, middle-income countries, can access these kind of global financial safety nets. The rest of the world, essentially, they have to figure out for themselves how they're going to how they're going to deal with this crisis. And I think this is the doublespeak. This is the financial system at its worst that has been shown by this crisis and needs to be addressed immediately.
All right. I've been notified that our other panelist has joined us, and that is Chinwe Egwim. and she's the author of Understanding Economic Jargon and a senior economist at FBN Quest Merchant Bank in Nigeria, and she's joining us from Lagos. Hi, Chinwe.
Hi. I'm so sorry for joining in so late. I had a clash, but I've been in for a while, and I'm enjoying the conversation so far. And just to, shall I say, piggyback on what Abdul Malik said. I just wanted to share my views. So I'll try to do it very quickly because I know that we don't have so much time left because of the Q&A segment. But so Africa really is seeking to find the right balance between financing development and safeguarding debt sustainability, between investing in people and upgrading infrastructure, between long-term development objectives and pressing immediate needs, right? So a balanced approach is needed. And in order for us to get there, all stakeholders will need to raise their game, right? There are 5 approaches that I think can be adopted to find that right balance between development and debt. Because what you find is that you find African countries, I could use Nigeria as an example, you find high borrowing levels and you can't really see the impact of the money that has been borrowed on the economy. So development and debt, 3 will be directed at sub-Saharan African policy makers, and 2 will be directed at the international community as well as the private sector. So the first really is to generate higher public revenue. This is an area where sub-Saharan Africa lags when compared with other regions. Industry sources estimate that revenue collection is well below its potential, right? Now, closing that gap can be done. An example can be seen with Uganda, where with technical support from the IMF, reforms helped to raise the revenue to GDP ratio from about 11% in 2012 to almost 15% last year. It's progress. Of course, there's still room for improvement, but that's progress. The second approach is to make investment spending more efficient. So the reality is that only about 60% of the region's infrastructure spending translates into public capital stock, as I said earlier. The third would be to strengthen public debt management. A key objective is to boost debt transparency by providing accurate, comprehensive, and timely data. So that kind of keys into what the previous speaker said when he spoke about like not having enough information, you know, and intellectual capacity, the lack of economists out there. This in turn can help with building trust with investors, support domestic capital markets, and reduce debt service costs. The fourth approach would be advanced economies can attempt to do more, especially when it comes to aid. So perhaps maybe raising official development assistance to, let's say, 0.7% of donors' national income. I don't know if that's something to consider. Donors could also focus more on infrastructure by providing grants and concessional financing for projects with credibly high rates of return. Now, the fifth and the final, I feel like I'm rushing. The fifth and the final, we need more private sector players, including more foreign direct investment, to help close the significant financing gap. So we need to ensure that private and public players can both end up on the winning side. A good example can be blended finance. I don't know if any of the previous speakers has mentioned that, but blended finance, which brings together grants, concessional financing, and commercial funding. So I just wanted to share my views on the back of the conversations that I walked into.
All right, thank you, Chinwe. I think, you know, just sort of going from what Chinwe has mentioned there, a couple of things that could be worked on. We do have a question from one of the participants in this web discussion, and that is Chu Tefara, and they're asking what are the common interests between the EU and the African Union, obviously, because obviously going into these discussions, it would be nice to establish commonalities between the AU and the EU. How can they tap into those similarities or things that they are looking common interests that they're looking for in order to sort of move forward. And whether that is, a debt moratorium or a debt write-off, how could that work out? What do you see there in Brussels? Jean, perhaps you could touch on, what you see and what could help African countries perhaps next month.
Well, I mean, speaking as a debt organization, the most obvious common interest, we would say, between the EU and Africa is obviously sustainable development, right? I mean, the world came together in 2015 and kind of signed off on Agenda 2030, agreed to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved by 2030. It is a common agenda. It is a global historic agreement to basically put in place everything that is needed. I mean, there are 17 goals cutting across a wide range of areas, some of which we've touched upon, touching upon social sectors, touching about governance, touching on economy, touching on in the environment and climate. The world has to come together to address this. If the Africans and the Europeans don't work together, I don't think we're going to achieve the SDGs, certainly not in 2030, certainly not in 2050. The Paris Agreement, another global agreement that was signed in 2015, but with a much more urgent agenda. I mean, right now we see already the impacts of escalating climate catastrophes on Africa. We saw what happened with the locust plague. We've seen all the extreme climate events. If the Paris Agreement is not a common agenda, I don't know what is. I mean, as development organizations, we would argue that essentially an interest in upholding your own as European as the European Union, but also the African countries, your own obligations towards human rights is another common interest. I mean, as development actors, these are, for us, key important common interests. I mean, of course, you can argue politically, migration-wise, there are a range of political interests that we can talk about. But as development actors, those would be foremost.
Right, thank you, Jean. So Abdelmalek, would you like to add on to that, or what do you feel are the commonalities that could help with these negotiations, perhaps?
You mean beyond the commonalities that the EU Commission, as well as the AU, love five-star hotels and big discussions about how to change the world? I mean, if we are going to low-hanging fruits, we need to address some very simple issues. I believe that there must be a tax for brain drain, that every time a European company is hiring someone that was trained and formed by an engineering school that belongs to an African government or an African state, they will need to pay for this when they send people scouting those young people in hotels in our capitals, because they're really draining our talents, and local companies don't find the right talents right now. We don't have a matching between the digital skills and the employment. It is the case in Morocco, it is the case in Senegal as well, because we're still in this very weird situation where you have multinational companies that send lawyers and PR people to bring in young people from Africa to come work and give them a visa in 15 days. So this question needs to be addressed and addressed hard. We make it a discussion point with our partners. The second thing, if we look at what brings us together, first is the Mediterranean. And there is a key issue to be addressed on how we're going to secure the Mediterranean, how we're going to have this green digital factory in the north of Africa that can create positive externalities with West Africa for the Francophone zone, and with East Africa for the English-speaking zone. These are countries such as Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia or Egypt that are already on the path to reaching some level of development and have they're big enough to be able to have industries in some specific fields such as the automotive industry, aeronautics, digital world, outsourcing, offshoring. These are the kind of industries that would need influx of money, but as well influx of talents from Europe. And I would say a very pragmatic initiative. I think they should multiply by 10 the Erasmus Plus initiative, meaning that we can have circulation of talents and people can go study in Europe, but as well we can have in Africa European students, because it starts by mixing all of these people. And my personal conviction is that we as African, we have to at one point stop lamenting and begging for money, and we have to work very hard to be better on governance. We have to work very hard to be better on issues such as corruption and human rights. And this means that we would be able to solve a huge problem that we have in Africa, which is the complete disconnection between urban, global elites that live in huge and big cities, who think big, but our main ideas of reference are in the West. So we need a more bottom-up approach, and we need these elites. And I put myself inside of this. You know, it's not to criticize others, but we need to find a new common ground to be in public service, to be in politics, and to be able to drive our economies to the right standards, so we can go beyond the traditional arguments that, nah, we're not gonna give you money because we don't know what you're gonna do with it, and you're gonna spend it on cars, and you're not gonna spend it on hospitals and stuff like this. We need to be very strong on governance issues, on transparency, and I believe that the purpose is to have a huge initiative on digital to increase transparency of government in our countries, and it should come from within, maybe with international money, but this is the priority right now, because there is such a will from the populations to have transparency and accountability from their governments, that I believe that the digital world is part of the solution, not the whole solution, but this is an area in which Europe has great expertise, and in which there is a partnership to be built in order to find what brings us together and not what make us fall apart.
And Chinwe, maybe you could just mention to us from your, your viewpoint there in Nigeria, and perhaps also your experience in other African markets. What do you think are the commonalities that could also help with, talking about debt as an issue, in Brussels next month?
Oh no, I agree completely with what he said. The issue of governance, good governance, is yeah, like we need to, as African countries, really look inwards and try to sort that out, because it's causing we need better political will in African countries, including Nigeria. But yeah, I was going to touch upon just slightly the debt moratorium, because you had mentioned it, and just from another vantage point, of course, it's a good thing. But it could also lead to credit rating downgrades due to Eurobond terms of defaulting. And a rating downgrade would erode the benefits accrued from debt relief, as countries would have to pay more interest on the same volume of debt, right? So in as much as it's a good thing, there are also concerns around that when you speak to specific governments. There are concerns that the terms of multilateral debt relief and loan packages will restrict future policy direction. So I'll give an example with Nigeria, the IMF. Nigeria has received relief of about, I think, $3.4 billion, which is now banked in its external reserves, and is seeking funding from World Bank and the Africa Development Bank. But I'm also aware that there's specific policy direction that these multilaterals are advising the government to key into. An example would be the unification of the FX rate here in Nigeria. We have multiple windows for the exchange rate. So that's an example. If you read the documents, you would see that that's a concern for multilaterals. So I can see how the government would be reluctant to seek funding on the back of being, what's the best way to say this? Seek funding on the back of having to be restricted with regards to how to maneuver with their policy direction. So yes, the debt moratorium is being granted on condition that the funds are spent on only critically public services, which is important, which should be so. And then the other conditions include adhering to existing policies, reporting requirements, multilateral oversight, and transparency. So countries under the debt relief program are not allowed to incur debt from any other creditors for some. So I don't know if I'm going on and on, but yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you, that in as much as it's a good thing, it's something I support, but then so, there's also another side to it as well.
Oh, thank you, Chinwe. I think that you touched on a lot of important things about, you know, sort of a balancing act and managing these concerns. And of course, these concerns are very different for different African governments. Maybe we can go back to Abdelmalek for this one. I mean, I know you're in Morocco, but can African countries come together with a common interest on this? Because obviously where Nigeria is not where Morocco is on this issue. And that, you know, applies to Ghana, and you could, you know, look further, you know, afield to, I don't know, Ethiopia and Kenya and the like. I mean, how can they speak with one voice on this issue? Because obviously they have different priorities, and they have to deal with their own economies to start with.
Well, I believe that the only moment where we all feel that we are Africans and that we belong to a continent is when a country goes beyond the quarterfinals of the World Cup. This is when people start to say, I'm for Cameroon, I'm for Egypt, I'm for Morocco, for Nigeria. But we have very fragmented and very strong national identities, despite the fact that borders were sometimes created by colonization. But I would say that it is in our best interest maybe to split the economic discussion with the with the policy and politics. This is what Europe did when they started the European construction. They started with steel, I believe, and coal. And this has created an immense success story, even though we can see the Brexit right now. But for decades, it has ensured common prosperity. It helped countries that were in the south of Europe to build highways, to lift up their economies. So I believe that Africa is in a very specific situation where you have the East that has an almost comprehensive free trade zone that is going from Cairo to the Cape, with circulation of people, circulation of goods, circulation as well of ideas. You have a very, very much fragmented zone, which is Francophone Africa, where internal trade is very, very small. It's around 5%. It's much easier to send goods from China to Togo than to send goods from Lomé to Nigeria. So we have to deal with these issues very energically in the coming months, because there is a sense of urgency. And I believe that leaders as well need to find people that can be an incarnation of this economic voice of Africa. And I believe the time is right when you see 2 or 3 candidates to become head of the WTO, and that they are all credible and there is a massive consensus. I believe it's really an epiphany at this moment. Remember, the last, we've had an African Secretary General of the UN a few years ago. He just passed away last year. But we need someone from Africa at really the forefront of international organizations. And we need this circulation of ideas. And we need mentors. And when I look up to people like Mo Ibrahim, I believe he has done for the Voice of Africa much more than a lot of African presidents, because he was able to show that there are success stories, there are Democrats in Africa, there are people who are willing to go ahead and to move forward with this continent. So I believe it is our turn to do like the economist, you know, to go from Africa doomed in 2000 to Africa on the rise in 2012. But we need to change our mental figures, to choose our sponsors, and to choose a task force that will be strong enough to negotiate with the EU by talking to the EU like a friend. Sometimes you need to talk to a friend about harsh stuff, and we need to clean the air about a lot of elephants in the room, and we need to slaughter some sacred cows if we want to move forward. But we will not go out of this situation with cosmetic solutions, and we will not go out of this situation by saying that we're going to put $50 billion and a Marshall Plan in Africa. It simply doesn't work.
And maybe Jean, if you could just tell us how you see things, you know, can African countries in Brussels negotiate or speak to the EU with one voice, especially on this, you know, debt issue, which is obviously affecting several countries that, you know, with varying situations, obviously, but would you potentially see them speaking with one voice? How is it in your work?
Well, absolutely. It's very important to present a united voice in Brussels, but also across the world in whichever official space that countries negotiating together. Africa together is very strong and can potentially move a lot. I mean, even when they try the hardest, and I've witnessed a couple of international negotiations where we've seen Africa together with a number of developing countries standing together and putting a stand. On the one hand, you have, I suppose, the carrots or the sticks that are dangled by donors, by investors, by a whole lot of interests that sometimes undermine this unity, and we have to recognize that. On the other hand, you have a very unequal global order. So if you're talking about more African leadership, which I fully subscribe to, in international institutions. The institutions that we work with the most are in Washington, the IMF and the World Bank. If you're talking about the governance and the leadership selection of the IMF and the World Bank, it is totally unfair at the moment. And given the current gentleman's agreement in which the US will always, until that is changed, head the World Bank, and the EU will always get to nominate who is heading the IMF, things are not going to change. I think this needs to be immediately called out. This is an opportunity to call out the unequal global governance system. I mean, talking about the need for revenue, raising revenue in Africa, I totally get Chingwe's point. But if you look at some of the issues that are preventing robust revenue collection, it's illicit financial flows. The Mbeki panel has pointed to that. How much has been done with regards to curbing illicit financial flows by the OECD, which incidentally is a club of industrialized countries, nothing more than that. Essentially very little. And one can ask why, and one can ask whether it is because of who are the interests that are served by norm-setting bodies like the OECD, and you get the answer over there. So I think it is important indeed. The AU, the African continent have to make a concerted effort. But on the other side of the coin, things will not move if we continue to have the current unequal global governance system that we have in place at the moment.
Thank you, Jean. So of course we've heard there from all of you about speaking, well, from both you, Jean and Abdul Malek, about Africa speaking with one voice. And one thing that could help with that is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But obviously we have issues with that, with the COVID pandemic, ongoing COVID pandemic. And of course, this perhaps debt write-off or no write-off, we'll see what happens. And we have a question from Eachu Tefera once again, and they want to know what sort of challenges will the African Free Trade Agreement have along the way if there is no debt write-off, for instance. Do the debt negotiations, will they potentially impact the AFCFTA? Shall we start with Abdel Malek on this one?
Sorry, I lost the connection. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, we have a question on basically, will the any debt write-off or no write-off, depending on what happens, will it affect the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? Someone wants to know how that will potentially be affected.
Well, I'm trying to think of a bridge between the two issues. Maybe the quality of the refinancing after an eventual write-off can have an impact on trade flows in Africa and on ZLECAf. But I'm not sure that we would be able to put a price or a number on this. I think it would act, it might act on confidence and trust in both ways. It can be negative for the lenders and people who used to give money, and it can be positive for people that were really strangled by the level of the service of the debt, and for some countries that are trying to diversify their economy. But I think it's a long shot. I don't see a direct link between the two issues. Question of trade has more to do with the tariffs and barriers and customs than with macroeconomics. So of course it's important to have a stable macroeconomic environment and a stable institutional environment. At the end of the day, if you get a debt write-off, you're buying time for a lot of governments that are fearing instability. So it will have an impact on trade, but I would say that it will have an impact on everything, because if you are able to guarantee stability and security, I mean, then you are giving the right conditions for economies to restart again.
Chinwei, how
can I add something to what he said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. Yes, so I agree completely with what he said. I just wanted to add that for countries that have high debt servicing, again, I would use Nigeria as an example, it would allow them or give them to be able to retarget their funds. So I believe it should assist with boosting capital expense. And for the AFCFTA and all the back and forth that's been going on, particularly with Nigeria on this, structural deficit is a big issue here, right? And things like power, road transport, logistics, all of that. I believe that it would take off pressure on using funds to service debt and perhaps help with retargeting the funds towards infrastructure development that would allow them compete better in this free trade area agreement. But at the same time, the conversation around boosting revenue, government revenue, should also encourage a country like Nigeria to engage in trade, because of course diversification, as Abdul said, diversification, diversifying away from oil for a country like Nigeria and looking into non-oil exports, and the trade agreement allows for that. That would encourage, or that would boost non-oil export receipts. So I just wanted to say on this side it looks this way, and on the other side it looks that way.
Yeah, Chino, you point out some very interesting things there. I'm just kind of trying to get into the head of anyone who's working in this area. It's kind of it sounds like a tricky balancing act. There's of course the debt write-off, which could be bad for borrowing on the private market, international market, Eurobonds and raising funds, because of course it could affect credit ratings and the like. And then on the other hand, you just mentioned a debt write-off, which would allow, the government, the Nigerian government, for instance, to have funds to invest elsewhere instead of, servicing debt. What kind of, just how hard and how tricky is this balance? And, is there a sweet spot somewhere?
Okay, well, the thing is, in as much as I'm saying that funds should be retargeted towards infrastructure development, if you look at the budget for Nigeria, you would see that the capital expense, the ratio to total budget has increased marginally. Of course, it's a good thing, but it should be way more than that because so much goes into recurrent expenditure. So in as much as I'm saying that that's the technical or ideal thing to do, if we're going to ease pressure on the debt service financing, I would hope that the government will retarget funds as should, because they've also had the opportunity to boost capital expenses, and the pace at which they've done it or they do it is somewhat slow in my personal opinion. So yeah.
I didn't unmute my mic, sorry about that. Jean, I was just gonna quickly ask, like finding this balance between, a debt write-off and, what it could mean as well for the economy. What kind of differences do you notice? Where are different African countries at? Do you have any view of, maybe for some countries it would make sense to have a debt write-off, whereas for others it is maybe not sensible at this point, given the options on the table? Obviously, we need to put that in mind. Do you see any variations between economies?
Well, we actually are arguing for a much broader write-off rather than differentiating, although there are some who are calling for a case-by-case view of this, particularly the private creditors, not surprisingly. We are calling for a much broader debt write-off, not only suspension, but really a write-off, because we believe that there are a number of countries who essentially are right now in a situation where they're spending much more on servicing their debt. A lot of it is very, very expensive debt on the private market, rather than spending it or where it's needed the most. First of all, on humanitarian spending to address the pandemic, but secondly, to really restart economies again, where essentially revenues have dried up in many economies across the world. It's not just in Africa, but right across the world. But it's just that the access to credit and the access to finance to restart economies in certain parts of the world are in a totally different league than in countries that have, for instance, access to central bank swaps or other forms of regional arrangements. In countries in Africa, you don't have access to that. You need that oxygen that would be provided by that debt cancellation to restart your economy. First of all, to spend on your population to ensure that you can take care of populations that are right now really impacted by the corona crisis, for sure. But beyond that, to restart the economy. So our call is actually to move beyond just the list of IDA countries and the least developed country list, but to move beyond that to even to developing small island country states, as well as to some lower middle income countries, and even beyond that. That would be our call, but unfortunately that's not on the table. Let's remember that that's right now not on the table. Right now all we are being told is possibly at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, possibly at the G20, they might consider extension of the deadline for the suspension initiative to be ended, because right now it is December 2020, and that's tomorrow. What we are calling for, and this is what the Africa Union has called for, is at least to extend it to 2024. And that is only for a very limited group of countries. So, I mean, I think we're just at the start of a very, very long battle in that regard, absolutely.
All right, thank you, Jean. And I think the question that we have from someone watching the discussion, Papando, is perhaps also directed at you. And it goes, can African countries make it a legal argument based on shared responsibilities and even bad advice that this was basically, beyond their control? Is this going to be a legal argument that they could, potentially use? What are your thoughts?
I've never heard of this, but it's certainly something worth exploring. I mean, unfortunately, right now, we do not have economic courts that would adjudicate on the faults that of macroeconomic policy advice that the IMF have made all these years. If there were a space where that could be adjudicated, I'm sure there would be a massive case to make for first of all, donors as well as the likes of the IMF to be tried and to be found guilty and to remedy for all the bad advice and all the basic negligence that the global development community has been guilty of all these years.
Thank you. And perhaps, I don't know if Chinwe is still with us. I just wanted to direct a question at her first of all, maybe. And then, of course, if it's not Chinwe who starts, maybe we can start with Abdelmalek. Do you see this as an opportunity for African countries to look at how they manage debt? And if so, are they actually using it as an opportunity, at least for some governments? And maybe if Chinwe could just maybe talk about the Nigerian government, perhaps, and any other, other governments that you are, looking at. Are they looking at this as an opportunity to really rethink things? So, of course, we've talked about outside forces quite a bit, but what about what the governments are doing themselves, at this point? And any conversations you've had or, heard of?
Okay, in my opinion, I believe that yes, they are using this. I think the pandemic has really dragged a lot of things to the front burner, and this is one of them. Again, if I want to hone into Nigeria, like before the pandemic, the debt management office was already trying to manage debt, and at the time, I think the ratio to domestic borrowing and external borrowing was about 70 something to 20 something, 70 being domestic and then 20 something being external. With regards to sourcing funds to give more fiscal room to combat the headwinds that have come along with the pandemic, I believe that they're also being very cautious. If you notice, it's concessionary loans from multilaterals that are being sought after, as opposed to the proper external financing. Well, not proper, but external financing that they would ordinarily go for. I know that there are conversations around going back into the Eurobond, issuing a Eurobond. I know there are conversations around that, but there are also concerns around, the rating, what the credit rating agencies have done in terms of downgrading. So yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, I do think that they are rethinking with regards to borrowing. I just hope that this rethinking will be sustainable, that it's not just because of the short pandemic has triggered with regards to economic downturn. Because if I date back to 2014, 2015, when Nigeria faced a recession, one would have thought that the oil price crash at the time would have resulted in so much more with regards to just repositioning the country to be able to protect itself or build buffers against shocks like what we're seeing now. So my hope is that it's not for the moment. Like, it's something that will be sustainable. So I hope I answered you properly.
Well, I mean, of course, at some point we're kind of speculating as well, because obviously you're just sort of basing it on your observations. So I totally understand that, and you did answer the question. And I also want to turn over the same question to Abdelmalek, whether he feels that, how do you feel about this? Is this an opportunity? Is this being seen as an opportunity by the Moroccan government to look at debt differently? And of course, you know, if there's any other governments in your region or across the continent that you are aware of, you know, in terms of how they're looking at this, maybe you could touch on that as well.
Well, I believe that we've already missed a lot of opportunities since April, because I believe that a lot of African governments could have raised some debt, some additional debt in April, when Israel was raising $5 billion on the 7th of March over 100 years. And what I hope is that the conversation will shift from the focus on the ratio to be more focused on productivity and what we do with the money. Spain almost collapsed with a ratio of 73%, and Japan is still very much resilient with a ratio of, I believe, 250% or something like this on debt over GDP. The question is about trust, how we can mobilize national money. In Morocco, we have banks are piling up with national money, but people don't want to put this money in other sectors rather than real estate. They don't want to put it into industry. They don't want to put it into digital, because the climate of doing business is not effective enough for this money to be more productive than putting it in real estate. So as I told you, for me, the alpha and omega of all things is reforming our governance, building trust, and we could have some low-hanging fruits, because we have a lot of African talents that are abroad, that have access to capital, and we have to build this big African initiative of neopats. When I go to Nigeria, I see so many of my Nigerian friends who used to work in markets and in capital in London, in New York, and they went back to their country. They don't have Annabelles anymore to go hang out there and have a drink at clubs, but they're contributing to their economy. They know very well the limits of what they can do there. But I believe that neopats are part of the solution, and their capital in the West, in the Occidental world, will not give them any return right now. The only zone in the world where they can get return is in Africa. And maybe the only zone in the whole planet where you can still get return that is close to 2 digits is Africa. So what will all these countries that will have at almost negative interest rates do with all the cash that they have retained for the last 6 months? Mm-hmm. They need to put it somewhere. And I believe that our portfolio of projects needs to reach critical size. We should have transnational portfolio project when it comes to energy, to renewables, when it comes to huge initiatives, and to be able to, I mean, to sum it up, you know, and to be very concise. The way we will come together as Africans to present projects that are transnational will be the key to the way we will raise money, and we will put at the best place the money that we can raise from the debt. It is no surprise that one of the richest men in Africa is Aliko Dangote. It's not because he's Nigerian and because Nigeria has oil. It's because he's operating in so many in so many countries at the bottom of the pyramid, and he's servicing a critical mass of clients. So we need African champions. We need big African companies, and we need for them capital, because they need to restructure their P&L and they need to be able to invest. This is where I would put my money, and I would simply you know, send to rest the guys that are in charge of debt management. This has been commoditized now. You can buy it from anyone to manage your debt. You don't need civil servants with expensive cars and huge public buildings to tell you that they are dealing with debt. I mean, you can do it through artificial intelligence or give it to one of the big fours. They will do it much better than public administration. Let's put the money in productive areas and not give it to huge and bigger administrations, because administrations know only one thing: to create more administrations.
Thank you, Abdelmalek. And perhaps we also actually have a question, Jean, that you could perhaps help answer that has come in. And Abdelmalek talked about, African champions there. And the question that we have here is, says, what do you suggest to the African diaspora to advocate in the upcoming EU-AU conference or summit in October? What should the African diaspora do? Do they have a role to play in this?
I don't think I'm in a position to tell the African diaspora what to do. I'm sure that the African diaspora knows well what their interests are and how the EU should serve those interests. What I certainly hope for is that there would be a louder voice, a louder support, first of all, to remind the EU of basically its responsibilities, and not only the EU, but also the African continent and the countries of Africa, of their responsibility, first of all, to their citizens in this pandemic. And I think ensuring, first of all, that the humanitarian financial spending is in place to deal with the pandemic, to deal particularly with those who are most immediately impacted by the pandemic, is and should be the most urgent thing that should be on everybody's mind at the moment. If this is not addressed, then we're going to see the repercussions of it in the sea, in humanitarian catastrophes. So I would say that is and should be first and foremost in everybody's mind at this point of time. And we would hope that the public opinion, including those with Africa closest to their hearts, would certainly support this. Secondly, really to demand much more than what is currently on the table. I mean, honestly, the debt service suspension initiative is a tiny band-aid on a huge bleeding wound. It's certainly not going to do anything but give a few months of, like I said, emergency respiratory support to countries who need it the most, while other countries are still really gasping for breath. Essentially, it's, like I said, pushing the ball down the road. In a few years, that money will have to be repaid back. And another thing that we've not talked about this afternoon, that is the big elephant in the room, are private creditors. I think the whole issue of private debt has not come up and is still a big, huge discussion right now. I mean, I understand the need for access to fresh capital, understand the need that there is not enough of concessional finance, but this accumulation of private credit and private debt at a time where there is no adequate governance internationally to deal with sovereign debt is going to blow up in our face one day or the other.
All right. So we've come, so far. We only have 5 minutes left, and because of that, I actually want to maybe try to do something a bit more. Hopefully, that will be a bit more on the positive note. I would like to ask each one of you to come up with 1 or 2 recommendations, and keep it very short and brief. And perhaps we should start with Chinwe in Nigeria, first of all, because I think I'll be curious to hear what the view would be from someone in the biggest market, population-wise, definitely in Africa. Chinwe, what recommendations would you come up with for this, to write off or to not write off the debt? What are your recommendations? 1 or 2 recommendations, and keep it short and brief.
I'm not going to give you I'm not going to say yes or no to that, but I think what I'm going to say is that fiscal discipline is important. Fiscal discipline is essential, and governments need to use this period as a wake-up call, given that most of the African governments, most of the African countries have really struggled with regards to combating what we're now facing because of no headroom. So fiscal discipline is important, and there has to be deliberate or intentional steps towards diversification now. So for countries that actually depend on one product, like Nigeria, the crude oil, economic diversification cannot remain an anthem. Deliberate steps now have to be taken to make it a reality so that fiscal buffers are created, and with regards to debt and borrowing, dependence on that can be reduced.
Thank you. And Abdelmalek, so I know it's a hard one. You know, everybody is grappling with it, but just briefly, 1 or 2 recommendations on, you know, what to be done with the debt.
And I believe that even a few months of relief is something that should be embodied, and that since Europe has done quantitative easing and is basically doing a write-off on its own debt, I believe we could be able to add Africa's debt on its signature, or at least to refinance it on a much longer term, because all of the old paradigm has were lifted. Nobody's going to talk about gearing right now. We need cash because we have social issues that we need to deal with, and we have to reconcile long-term with short-term. I believe that the most urgent thing is first to give a breath of fresh air to countries that are having problems with their healthcare systems, and to be sure that their healthcare systems will be resilient enough. And for this first initiative, very simple in terms of debt, we need a fast track in terms of patterns for patents, for all the respiratory equipment that have been fabricated over the last months by African countries, and they are not able to put them in hospitals because they don't get European patents. There is no fast track. Today, if you create a respiratory unit, you need 1.5 years to have it patented by the US, by the European Patent Office. And the second thing is that we need a helicopter of money, but national money. And I believe that those countries need, our countries need as well, to raise some debt internally and to put some kind of exceptional tax on businesses that are on monopolies or that are on very specific situations. Because we will need to go beyond the contributions that were made to special funds all over Africa. And there is no magic recipe. We need a policy mix when it comes to debt. We need to bring the money wherever, but priority of priority is for each country to build a task force that is able to see, to create a portfolio of businesses to invest in, and that are under distress right now and that are cash strapped. Those businesses grow very fast in trade, in distribution, in economy, and they need cash right now if we want people to deliver the goods. That's the main idea.
All right, thank you, Abdelmalek. And Jean, yeah, very briefly, I know it's a hard one, but yeah, it's sort of like the exam trick question, and hopefully you just do your best.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just reiterate extension of the current debt service moratorium to 2024 is our absolute minimum that we would ask for. We would also ask for extension of the moratorium to all developing countries who ask for it, request it. I think beyond that, we really need to address the tyranny of credit rating agencies. I think there are a number of best practices, but instances on which countries have been able to push them back. And I think the EU has demonstrated that. I don't think it's impossible. We can do it. And finally, I think really addressing the chaotic governance system of sovereign debt, so that we have an orderly system in place to address the current chaos that we face with the sovereign debt regime.
Thank you, Jean. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of our discussion today, Africa's Debt, to Write Off or Not to Write Off. And it was, of course, hosted by ADEPT and MERIDIA Partners. And our speakers were Jean Saldanha of Eurodat, the European Network on Debt and Development in Brussels, and then Abdelmalek Alaoui, the president of the Moroccan Institute for Strategic Intelligence in Rabat. And then last but not least, Chinwe Egwim, the author of Understanding Economic Jargon and a senior economist with FBN Quest Merchant Bank in Nigeria. So thank you. And of course, you can keep the discussion ongoing online. This is the first of 5 web discussions, so there's more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.